Vincent Gigante, once the odd father, lost his fortune to decades of legal battles. Frank Lucas saw his drug empire collapse after betrayal and arrests. Joe Bonanno's wealth vanished through government crackdowns and internal mafia conflicts. These once powerful bosses are now stripped of money and influence. Al Capone.
My son is now 12. I'm still married and I love my wife dearly.
Al Capone, the name itself conjures images of Prohibition-era Chicago, Tommy guns, bootleg whiskey, and absolute control over an entire city's criminal underworld. During the roaring 1920s, Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was practically a celebrity, a household name who operated with such brazen confidence that he seemed untouchable. At the peak of his power as boss of the Chicago outfit, Capone controlled an empire estimated to be worth $100 million. That's the equivalent of approximately $1.5 billion in today's money. His operations spanned bootlegging operations, gambling houses, prostitution rings, and protection rackets that generated money faster than his accountants could count it. But Capone's downfall didn't come from rival gangsters or vigilante citizens. It came from something far more mundane and far more devastating: the United States Internal Revenue Service. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of February 14, 1929, where 7 members of rival Bugs Moran's gang were brutally executed in a North Clark Street garage, shocked the American public and galvanized federal authorities. The federal government's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. A 1927 Supreme Court ruling had established that illegal income was taxable income. If they couldn't convict Capone for bootlegging or murder, they'd get him for not paying taxes on his ill-gotten gains. On June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion, with prosecutors alleging he owed $215,000 in back taxes on $1,038,654 in unreported income between 1925 and 1929. His extravagant lifestyle, the custom suits, the jewelry, the $40,000 Florida mansion, became evidence against him. On October 17, 1931, he was convicted on 5 counts. 7 days later, he received the longest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion at that time: 11 years in federal prison, plus $50,000 in fines and $7,692 in court costs. Released on November 16, 1939, after serving nearly 8 years, Capone was a shell of his former self. His wife had appealed for his release on humanitarian grounds, citing his severe mental deterioration. The man who once controlled Chicago retired to his Palm Island mansion in Florida, where he lived his final years in confused obscurity. Penicillin treatment in 1942 slowed but couldn't reverse the damage. By 1946, his mental capacity had regressed to that of a 12-year-old child. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died at age 48 from cardiac arrest following a stroke and pneumonia. The man who once had $100 million at his fingertips died with debts and no recoverable wealth. The federal government had seized what assets they could find, and the rest had been spent on legal fees, medical care, and supporting his family during his decade-long decline. If Al Capone was the face of American organized crime, Meyer Lansky was its brain. Meyer Lansky. Known as the mob's accountant, Lansky was a financial genius who helped establish the National Crime Syndicate and built gambling empires from Las Vegas to Havana, Cuba. Born Meyer Sucholyansky in what is now Belarus, Lansky immigrated to New York in 1911 and quickly proved himself to be not just another street thug, but a sophisticated criminal mastermind with an uncanny ability to manage money and evade law enforcement. During his peak years in the 1940s and 1950s, Lansky's wealth was estimated at a staggering $400 million, generated through casino operations, illegal gambling, bootlegging, and countless other criminal enterprises. He was the money man for figures like Bugsy Siegel and Lucky Luciano, the financial architect who could make millions appear and disappear with the stroke of a pen. His crown jewel was his Cuban operation, where he partnered with dictator Fulgencio Batista to develop luxury casino hotels like the Hotel Nacional. Then came January 1, 1959, and Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution. In a single stroke, Lansky's Cuban empire was nationalized and seized. He lost an estimated $7 million, worth over $60 million in today's money, fleeing Cuba with only $3 million in cash that he'd managed to smuggle out. This was just the beginning of his financial unraveling. The FBI, which had been surveilling Lansky for decades, intensified its efforts. By the 1960s, he was living modestly in Miami Beach, deliberately keeping a low profile, but authorities believed he had hidden fortunes exceeding $300 million in offshore accounts. The hammer hammer fell in 1970. Lansky was indicted on federal tax evasion charges, accused of failing to report over $1 million in income from his various rackets. Facing decades in prison, the 68-year-old mobster made a desperate gamble. On September 10, 1970, he fled to Israel, seeking citizenship under the law of return as a Jew born in what was then part of the Russian Empire. For 2 years, Lansky lived in Israel while his lawyers fought extradition and argued for his right to remain. But Israel's Supreme Court had other plans. On September 11, 1972, they denied his citizenship application, citing his extensive criminal history and determining that his presence posed a threat to public welfare. It was a humiliating defeat for a man who had spent his entire career in the shadows, manipulating outcomes from behind the scenes. Lansky returned to the United States in October 1972, where he was immediately arrested at Miami International Airport. What followed were years of legal battles that drained whatever resources Lansky had left. In 1973, he was convicted of contempt of a grand jury, though the verdict was overturned on appeal. More significantly, he was acquitted of the tax evasion charges in 1974 due to insufficient evidence and procedural issues. Other charges, including conspiracy, were dropped in 1976, with prosecutors citing his failing health. By this point, Lansky was battling both heart disease and lung cancer. He lived quietly in a modest apartment in Miami Beach, a far cry from the penthouses and luxury hotels of his glory years. The man who supposedly controlled $300 million in offshore accounts was, on paper, worth almost nothing. Meyer Lansky died on January 15, 1983, at age 80 from lung cancer at Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami Beach. When his estate was settled, his family inherited approximately $57,000, a pittance for a man once worth hundreds of millions. Despite persistent rumors of hidden millions stashed in Swiss bank accounts and offshore havens, none of it ever materialized. George "Bugs" Moran. George "Bugs" Moran, born Adelard Leo Cunin in either 1891 or 1893 in St. Paul, Minnesota, earned his notorious nickname from his volatile, unpredictable temper that made even hardened criminals wary of crossing him. As leader of the North Side Gang in Chicago during the Prohibition era, Moran was one of Al Capone's most formidable rivals, controlling lucrative bootlegging territories on Chicago's North Side and living the high life as a one-time millionaire who seemed destined to remain a power player in organized crime for decades to come. But fate, as it often does in the underworld, had brutally different plans. The St. Valentine's Day massacre of February 14, 1929, remains one of the most infamous events in American crime history. 7 members of Moran's gang were executed in a North Clark Street garage in what was widely believed to be a hit orchestrated by Al Capone, though he was never charged. The victims were lured by a fake whiskey deal, then lined up against a wall and machine-gunned by assailants, 2 of whom were disguised as police officers. Moran himself escaped death purely by chance. He arrived late to the meeting, saw the police cars outside, and fled to a nearby cafe. In 1939, Moran was convicted of conspiracy to forge $62,000 in checks. He fled after his appeal was denied, but was eventually recaptured and served until 1944. This was just the beginning of a spiral of arrests and imprisonments that would define his final years. On July 6, 1946, he was arrested for robbing a tavern manager in Dayton, Ohio, a crime that had occurred on June 28, 1945 or 1946, depending on the source. Along with accomplices Virgil Summers and Al Fouts, Moran had kidnapped the manager and stolen $10,000. The trial in Dayton became a media circus, drawing national attention as the once powerful Chicago gang leader stood accused of what amounted to a stick-up job. The jury deliberated only briefly before finding him guilty. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Sources vary on the exact length. When he was paroled in 1956, the 63-year-old Moran was completely broke, abandoned by his wife, and facing immediate rearrest. He was convicted in 1957 for a 1945 bank robbery in Ansonia, Ohio, and received another 10-year sentence. This final imprisonment proved to be his death sentence. George "Bugs" Moran died of lung cancer on February 25, 1957, at age 63 or 65, depending on his actual birth year, just months into his final sentence at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He had spent decades in and out of prison, dying behind bars with absolutely no assets to his name. The man who had once been a millionaire bootlegger, who had survived the St. Valentine's Day massacre and gone toe-to-toe with Al Capone for control of Chicago, was buried in the prison cemetery, a quiet, ignominious end for one of the era's most notorious gangsters, Luciano. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, didn't just participate in organized crime, he revolutionized it. Luciano is credited with establishing both the National Crime Syndicate and the Commission in 1931, creating a corporate-style structure for organized crime that replaced the bloody, chaotic gang wars of the 1920s with a more efficient, business-like approach to criminal enterprise. He earned his famous nickname Lucky after surviving a brutal 1929 attack where rivals slit his throat and left him for dead. He lived bearing the scars for the rest of his life.
Charles Lucky. Lucky Luciano. What was his power? What was his talent? What kind of a man?
He believed to make money.
At the height of his power in the 1930s, Luciano's operations generated an estimated $5 million in 1925 dollars, equivalent to approximately $80 million today. His criminal portfolio included bootlegging during Prohibition, narcotics trafficking, illegal gambling operations, and a massive prostitution ring that generated millions annually. Luciano seemed untouchable, having consolidated power after orchestrating the murders of rivals Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano during the Castellamarese War, effectively ending the old-style boss of bosses system and ushering in a new era of cooperative organized crime. But Luciano's empire caught the attention of an ambitious special prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey, who would later become governor of New York and twice run for president. Dewey understood that going after Luciano for murder or bootlegging would be nearly impossible. Witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, and no one would testify. So he took a different approach. In February 1936, Dewey's team raided over 80 brothels, gathering testimony from prostitutes and madams who detailed Luciano's control over the city's vice operations. On April 1, 1936, Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he had been hiding from a New York warrant. After extradition, he was indicted on 90 counts of compulsory prostitution, essentially running a forced prostitution racket. His trial began on May 13, 1936, in New York Supreme Court. Dewey presented a parade of witnesses, over 40 in total, including prostitutes who testified that Luciano controlled the ring through violence and intimidation, taking a percentage of their earnings. Luciano's defense claimed his income came from legitimate gambling, but the evidence was overwhelming. On June 7, 1936, the jury convicted Luciano and 8 associates on 62 counts. 11 days later, he received a shocking 30 to 50-year sentence, the harshest punishment ever handed down for such charges at that time. Appeals failed, and Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, colloquially known as Dannemora, or Little Siberia, due to its harsh conditions and remote location. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack at Naples International Airport while meeting with a film producer about making a movie of his life. He was 64 years old. After special permission was granted, his body was returned to New York for burial. When his estate was settled, it was valued at a modest $100,000 to $1 million, a fraction of what one would expect from the man who founded the Commission and controlled much of America's organized crime for decades. Legal fees, the costs of living in exile, and the inability to access whatever hidden assets he might have had left Lucky Luciano far from wealthy at his death. The architect of modern American organized crime died in exile, with nowhere near the fortune his legacy would suggest. Vito Genovese.
Do you think
That's what they are.
And have you ever known anyone in the narcotics racket? Have you known anyone?
I never did.
Have you ever known anyone in the underworld?
The whole thing is ridiculous.
Vito Genovese was a mobster's mobster, ruthless, ambitious, and absolutely determined to become the boss of bosses that Lucky Luciano's commission system had supposedly abolished. Rising through the ranks of what would eventually bear his name as the Genovese crime family, Genovese spent the 1950s systematically eliminating rivals and consolidating power through a series of calculated assassinations that would have made Machiavelli proud. At his peak in 1957, his operations in narcotics and racketeering were estimated to generate $1 billion in annual revenue, an astronomical sum that made him one of the wealthiest criminals in American history. He allied with Carlo Gambino to orchestrate the assassination of rivals. On May 2, 1957, he ordered Vincent Gigante to kill Frank Costello, the acting boss, outside his Manhattan apartment. Costello survived with a head wound, but wisely chose to retire rather than face another attempt, allowing Genovese to take control. On June 2, 1958, he testified before the U.S. Senate's McClellan Committee Study on Organized Crime, invoking the Fifth Amendment an impressive 150 times. Just over a month later, on July 7, 1958, Genovese was indicted for conspiring to import and distribute narcotics. Many in the underworld believed the case was a frame-up, with rumors that Lucky Luciano paid $100,000 to have Genovese taken down, but the testimony was convincing enough for a jury. The trial resulted in a conviction on April 4, 1959, for federal narcotics conspiracy. On April 17, 1959, Genovese was sentenced to 15 years at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, a devastating blow to his ambitions of being the ultimate mob boss. But even from prison, the 61-year-old Don attempted to maintain control of his crime family through intermediaries and coded messages. His paranoia grew in confinement. In September 1959, he allegedly ordered the murder of Anthony Carfano, who had protested the Costello hit by skipping the Appalachian meeting. Carfano was shot in Queens. In April 1962, suspecting underboss Anthony Strollo of helping frame him, Genovese had him killed. Strollo's body was never found. Most significantly, Genovese's feud with fellow inmate Joseph Valachi escalated in 1962 when Genovese accused him of being an informant. In a tragic case of mistaken identity, Valachi killed another inmate in self-defense, then decided he had nothing to lose. He became a government witness testifying in 1963 about the Mafia's structure in televised hearings that captivated America. Vito Genovese died of a heart attack on February 14, 1969, at age 71, in the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He never saw freedom again. When authorities reviewed his assets, they found virtually nothing. His wealth had been seized, hidden in accounts he could no longer access or distributed to maintain family operations. Joe Bonanno. Joseph Joe Bananas. Bonanno was one of the youngest bosses ever appointed to lead one of New York's 5 families, taking control of the Bonanno crime family in 1931 at just 26 years old.
Your first hero
That's right.
was Salvatore
Maranzano.
Maranzano.
Yes.
But then you say he was said to be able to snap a man's neck with his fingers. And I say when I read that...
That's a metaphorical.
By the early 1960s, Bonanno had grown dissatisfied with merely being one boss among equals on the commission. He wanted more. In 1963, following the death of Joe Profaci, Bonanno allied with Profaci's successor, Joseph Magliocco, to orchestrate an audacious power grab. Their plan was to assassinate several rival commission members, including Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Stefano Magaddino, and Frank De Simone. The commission confronted Magliocco, who confessed to everything, and implicated Bonanno as the mastermind. Magliocco was fined $50,000, forced to retire, and replaced by the very man who had betrayed them, Joseph Colombo. Bonanno, identified as the architect of the murder plot, refused to appear before the commission to answer for his actions, an unforgivable breach of protocol. In mid-1964, facing mounting pressure and fearing for his life, he fled to Montreal, where he was detained for 90 days on immigration charges before being expelled from Canada. Then came one of the most bizarre episodes in Mafia history. On October 21st, 1964, conveniently the day before he was scheduled to testify before a grand jury about organized crime, Bonanno vanished from a New York City street while entering an apartment on Park Avenue. His 19-month absence left the Bonanno family in chaos. The commission appointed Gaspar Di Gregorio as interim boss, triggering what became known as the Banana War from 1964 to 1968, a violent internal conflict between Di Gregorio's faction and loyalists to Bonanno's son, Bill. The war claimed at least 13 lives, including casualties from a failed 1966 peace meeting in Brooklyn that devolved into a shootout. Di Gregorio was later wounded and replaced by Paul Siaka after suffering a heart attack. Bonanno dramatically resurfaced on May 17, 1966, appearing at a federal courthouse in Foley Square, New York, facing indictment for skipping the grand jury. Those charges were eventually dropped in 1971, but his return failed to end the internal war. After suffering a heart attack in 1968, Bonanno finally negotiated peace by agreeing to retire as boss and relocate to Arizona, with his son Bill resigning as consigliere. In 1985, during the famous commission trial, prosecutors wanted Bonanno to testify about revelations from his book. He refused, earning him 14 months for contempt of court. He was released on November 1, 1986. Joe Bonanno finally died on May 11, 2002, at age 97 in Tucson, Arizona, of heart failure. While he avoided the violent death or prison demise that claimed so many of his contemporaries, accounts from his later years describe a man living relatively poorly compared to his peak. Vincent Gigante. Vincent the Chin Gigante might be the most bizarre figure in modern organized crime history. As boss of the Genovese crime family from 1981 to 2005, he ran a multi-million-dollar criminal empire generating an estimated $100 million annually through extortion, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and bid rigging schemes. But what made Gigante truly unique wasn't his criminal prowess. It was his elaborate, decades-long act of feigning mental illness to avoid prosecution, earning him colorful nicknames like the Odd Father, the Enigma in the Bathrobe, and the Robe. Gigante's criminal career began in the 1950s as a boxer and enforcer, but he's perhaps best known for a botched assignment. In 1957, he was ordered to assassinate Frank Costello, the acting boss of what would become the Genovese family. Gigante ambushed Costello in the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building, shouting, "This is for you, Frank," before firing. The bullet grazed Costello's head, and he survived. The failed hit led to Vito Genovese's brief takeover, and surprisingly, Gigante's career wasn't derailed. He continued to rise through the ranks. By 1981, after Philip Lombardo's retirement, Gigante became boss. His operations expanded the Genovese family's traditional rackets, particularly focusing on extortion of New York City construction projects and bid rigging in window installation contracts with the New York City Housing Authority, schemes that generated tens of millions in illegal profits. On May 30th, 1990, Gigante was indicted along with 14 others for bid rigging multi-million-dollar window contracts with the Housing Authority, along with labor payoffs, extortions, and mail fraud. Additional charges in 1993 included conspiring to murder rivals like John Gotti. On July 25, 1997, Gigante was convicted of racketeering and murder conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from informants, surveillance footage, and intercepted communications all proved his leadership of the Genovese family despite his public facade. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The judge, while sentencing him, called him a shadow of his former self after decades of tyranny over the criminal underworld. Vincent Gigante died on December 19, 2005, at age 77, from heart disease while still in prison. He never saw freedom again. Despite his family's longtime claims of poverty, which were part of the Insanity Act, federal authorities had seized his assets over the years. When he died, there was little remaining wealth. The man who had generated $100 million annually for the Genovese family, who had successfully evaded justice for decades through one of the most elaborate deceptions in criminal history, died in a prison medical facility with virtually nothing to leave his family. Joseph Massino. Joseph Big Joey. Massino holds a unique and infamous distinction in American Mafia history. He was the first sitting boss of one of New York's 5 families to become a government informant, breaking the sacred code of omertà while still in power, as boss of the Bonanno crime family from 1991 until his arrest. In 2003, Massino rebuilt the family from its weakened state following decades of internal warfare and federal prosecutions, restoring its seat on the Mafia Commission by the mid-1990s and generating millions through traditional rackets like loan sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling. On January 9, 2003, federal agents arrested Massino at his Howard Beach home on racketeering charges tied to labor unions and arson. The initial charges were serious enough, but additional indictments soon followed for 7 murders, including the 1981 slaying of Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, the murdered captain who had unwittingly allowed FBI agent Joseph Pistone, working undercover as Donnie Brasco, to infiltrate the family in the late 1970s. His first trial in Brooklyn federal court began in May 2004. The prosecution presented a devastating case built on testimony from former associates, wiretaps, and financial records. On July 30, 2004, Massino was convicted of racketeering, extortion, arson, money laundering, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and conspiracy to commit murder. Facing a mandatory life sentence, Massino still had to face a second trial, this one seeking the death penalty for the 1999 murder of Gerlando Sciascia, who had been killed for challenging Massino's authority. In January 2005, he secretly agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, becoming the first boss of a New York crime family to flip while still actively leading his organization. The betrayal was shocking even to hardened federal prosecutors. Massino wore a wire in prison, recording incriminating conversations with his successor, Vincent "Vinny Gorgeous" Bassiano, who discussed ongoing hits and family business, apparently unaware he was talking to a rat. Massino's public cooperation became official when he testified in April 2005 2011 against Basciano in a highly publicized trial. For 5 days, the 68-year-old former Don detailed the inner workings of the Mafia, admitted to personally participating in or ordering 11 murders, and provided information that led to over 50 additional convictions. His testimony was crucial in securing Basciano's life sentence. In exchange, Massino forfeited approximately $10 million in assets to the federal government. On June 23, 2005, Massino was sentenced to 2 life terms, but with the understanding that his cooperation would be considered for leniency. Due to his extensive cooperation and declining health from diabetes and obesity, he was released on July 10, 2013, after serving approximately 10 years into the Witness Protection Program. He lived quietly under an alias, his location and new identity kept secret for his safety. Joseph Massino died on September 14, 2023, at age 80, from complications of liver disease in Nesconset, New York. He was buried under an alias. The man who had once controlled the Bonanno family's multi-million-dollar operations died, having given away most of his known wealth, forfeited to the government, spent on legal defense, or seized through asset forfeiture. Sam Giancana. Sam Momo Giancana led a life that reads like a Hollywood thriller, which is fitting since his story intersects with presidents, movie stars, CIA assassination plots, and one of the most mysterious murders in Mafia history. Rising to lead the Chicago outfit in 1957, Giancana commanded operations generating millions from casinos, particularly in Las Vegas and Illinois, extortion, loan sharking, and various other rackets. He lived lavishly, hobnobbed with celebrities, and allegedly shared a mistress, Judith Exner, with President John F. Kennedy, a connection that would later become scandalous when revealed. But Giancana's most bizarre connection was to the U.S. government itself. In the early 1960s, the CIA recruited him for Operation Mongoose, a plot to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. By the early 1960s, the heat was unbearable. In 1963, Giancana invoked the Fifth Amendment 42 times before a federal grand jury, refusing to answer questions about his criminal operations. This led to a contempt citation and a 1-year sentence in 1965, which he served at Cook County Jail and Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. But the legal pressure was just beginning. In 1965, prosecutors granted him immunity, which meant he could no longer invoke the Fifth Amendment. If called to testify, he would have to either tell the truth or face perjury charges, and telling the truth about the Chicago outfit's operations would likely result in his assassination. After 8 years in Mexico, Mexican authorities deported him in July 1974 under pressure from the U.S. government, which wanted him back for questioning. He returned to Chicago to face a very different landscape. The outfit had moved on without him, and his former underlings now viewed him with suspicion and hostility. Worse yet, the federal government still wanted his testimony. On June 19, 1975, just days before his scheduled return to Hassen, Washington for more testimony, Sam Giancana was murdered in his Oak Park home. The circumstances were chilling. He was in his basement kitchen cooking sausage and peppers late at night when someone he apparently trusted approached him from behind. The killer used a .22 caliber pistol with a silencer, shooting him 7 times, 6 shots in a circle around his mouth and 1 to the back of his head for good measure. Sam Giancana was 67 years old when he was murdered. He was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, the same cemetery where many other Chicago mobsters were laid to rest. At the time of his death, he had no major assets. Years in exile had depleted whatever fortune he'd accumulated during his time as boss, and he'd been unable to access outfit funds since losing power. Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas wasn't technically a mafia boss. He was never a made member of La Cosa Nostra, being African-American. But his connections to organized crime and his massive heroin empire in 1970s Harlem made him one of the era's most significant crime figures. His story became famous through the 2007 Ridley Scott film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington, which dramatized Lucas's rise and fall as one of Harlem's most notorious drug kingpins. His product, branded Blue Magic, became legendary in Harlem for its purity and potency. At the peak of his operation in the early 1970s, Lucas's operation was estimated to be worth $52 million, an enormous fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions today. He lived extravagantly, wearing chinchilla coats, driving expensive cars, and cultivating connections with celebrities and athletes. The raid came on January 28, 1975. Federal agents and NYPD officers stormed Lucas's home in Teaneck, New Jersey, seizing $584,000 in cash, quantities of heroin, and keys to to safe deposit boxes containing millions more. It was a devastating blow. Lucas was arrested on federal drug conspiracy charges, and his wife Julie initially fled but eventually surrendered. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just the physical evidence from the raid, but testimony from former associates who had flipped to save themselves. In 1976, Lucas was convicted and received a 70-year sentence, essentially a life sentence for a man in his mid-40s. But facing decades behind bars, Lucas made a fateful decision. He agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, becoming an informant against his former associates and competitors. His testimony led to the conviction of over 100 people involved in drug trafficking, including corrupt police officers, dealers, and other criminals in the heroin trade. Frank Lucas died of natural causes on May 30, 2019, at age 88 in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. At the time of his death, his estate was estimated at approximately $500,000, a modest sum for someone who had once controlled a $52 million heroin empire. The federal government had seized most of his fortune decades earlier, and what remained had been spent supporting himself and his family over nearly 4 decades since his first conviction. What do you think about the secret lives of these powerful mafia bosses? Share your thoughts in the comments and click the card on your screen to discover more untold stories.